My name is Debbie Douglas, and I'm the Executive Director of OCASI. It is always so good to join with my sector colleagues and allies to have these important conversations. It's always good to come together around refugee rights, day, week, month. I'm joining you, and this virtual panel is being hosted today on the Dish with One Spoon Treaty Territory. The Dishes with One Spoon is an agreement between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee and other allied nations to care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is home to a variety of First Nations, but also Inuit and Métis peoples. Welcome again. Every year, the Toronto Planning Committee for Refugee Rights Day marks April 4th, the anniversary of the Supreme Court decision, the Singh Decision, confirming refugee rights under the Canadian Charter. This panel is one of many events we organize individually and or collectively. We dedicate this year's panel and discussion to Jenny Jeans, the late Vice President of the Canadian Council for Refugees and a tireless champion for refugee rights, and the many courageous refugee claimants who place their hope and trust in Canada. I invite my colleague, Aleks Manzur, past president of the Canadian Council for Refugees, to help us remember and celebrate Jenny's life. Aleks?
Thank you, Debbie, and hello, everyone. It is with a lot of grief that I do this commemoration for Jenny. She passed a few weeks ago, and Jenny was a brilliant, compassionate, and deeply principled leader. For over 2 decades, she worked tirelessly to support refugee claimants and people held in immigration detention. I had the honor of working closely with Jenny since 2018. She was a colleague, a mentor, and a friend, and her generosity and strength and fierce commitment to justice and unwavering support for others shaped our movement and touched countless lives. As Debbie was saying, we also honor the many courageous refugee claimants who have placed their hope and trust in Canada. I want to say that Jenny never lost sight of them, and neither will we. And in honor of her, we hold this day today and hope that we will be inspired to continue the work and especially supporting people in detention. That is a work that she has done for 20 years. So thank you very much for your attention to this.
Thank you so much, Aleks. Many of our hearts, many of those of us who know Jenny, our hearts are heavy because her passing was so unexpected, but she leaves quite the legacy of kindness, of ease, and of grace. We're thankful, I'm thankful to have walked part of this journey with her. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our brilliant moderator, Dr. Yvonne Sue, Director of the Center for Refugee Studies and a passionate champion for refugee rights in Canada. As this is a 1-hour event, I won't read her very long bio, but you can certainly find it in the chat under biographies. Yvonne, the floor is yours. I look forward to a dynamic conversation this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Debbie, for inviting me and for organizing this panel. So I'll just start with just a few comments to set the stage. So we are living in unprecedented times. I think many of you feel this, just watching the news yesterday and thinking about it today and probably speaking with your family and friends about it. I think many of us in the refugee and immigration world thought that 2024 was a bad year. with all the changes to the temporary migration policy, as well as the dramatic decrease in immigration goals, the pausing of the grandparent and parent sponsorship program, as well as the suspension of the Group of 5 refugee sponsorship program. 2024 just seemed like it was a year full of policy changes, at least every 2 months. And immigrants were continually demonized, refugees were scapegoated, and everyone who was seen as a foreigner was made to look like the problem. This culminated in strong anti-immigrant sentiments and xenophobia. So much so that for the first time in a quarter century, a clear majority of Canadians say there is too much immigration. Then 2025 came and hit us like a Cybertruck. Not just us, the world was thrown into uncertainty. With the threats of annexation, Canadians have come together and united against a common enemy and threat. We were no longer talking about this more invisible or theoretical invasion of immigrants or refugees who just want jobs and safety, but Americans who are a real threat to our sovereignty and identity. And I think that juxtaposition is really important for us to hold. As a professor, this was so weird to see. Because teaching refugee and migration studies for the past 10 years, I've tried many times to get my students to feel displacement, not just learn about it from a book, to listen to podcasts and documentaries, to put them in the shoes of those who are forced to leave their homes. Now I have a real life example for students to reflect on, that they may face the threat of war and have to decide if they will stay or go, and realize then that the judgment that we cast on refugees from other places, the concerns that we have over if taxpayers' dollars are wasted, they're no longer concerns. Instead, if they were to be refugees, if Canadians were to be refugees, we actually want the exact same treatment that they were railing against. We want healthcare, jobs, safety, education, fairness, and welcoming hosts. So we are living under really strange and uncertain times. And I want to finish by saying that with that comes opportunity. The old ways of doing things is being broken and remade every single day. How can we remake our systems along with it? How do we go through and get rid of the bad and keep the good? For example, is our refugee system fair? Should Canada have detention centers? And where should they be housed? Who should pay for them? Should we cancel the Safe Third Country Agreement? How should we treat LGBTQ plus asylum seekers in the US who are fearing persecution under Trump? And what are our big ideas for refugee and immigration in the next 4 years or the next 10 years? What do we want Canada to look like? And how can refugees and immigrants be a big part of that future? So we'll be talking about that today with our amazing panel of speakers. And in the interest of not just time, but also like connecting with each other, instead of reading the formal bios, which we will be posting or have posted, they will just take us a second or so to introduce themselves and share how they're feeling. And I'll go through this order. So we have Aleks Dughman Manzur from Rainbow Refugee Society, Aleks Vernon from University of Detroit Mercy, Orlando Tovar from Rainbow Refugee Association of Scotia, and Eusebio Garcia from Quaker Committee of Refugees. So why don't you guys just take a quick second to say hi, introduce yourselves, and then we'll get into some questions.
Hi, everyone. As Yvonne was saying, my name is Aleks Dughman Manzur. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the co-executive director of Rainbow Refugee Society. I'm also co-chair of From Borders to Belonging, past president of the Canadian Council for Refugees, and executive committee member. I want to say also and acknowledge that Monday we were celebrating Trans Day of Visibility, and this is important because of the intersections between migration and identity and gender identity and everything that's going on right now. I have been doing this work with protecting and advocating for refugee rights since 2016. I am a settler here in Canada who came in 2008 as an international student, and then the migration pathway started. But I'm also a Palestinian by ethnic origin who was born and raised in Santiago de Chile, and a trans person. So all of those identities now come together in the work that I do. And I think what I want to emphasize is that although we are going through hard times, and although right now everything seems to be narrated against the refugees and migrants from the US, or here we're hearing new narratives around that, I want to say that I do hold hope that our communities are strong and that we will fight and win to make sure that refugees are protected and that our rights are being upheld in Canada. I don't want to take more time because I know my colleagues also need to introduce themselves, so I'll pass it along to Aleks, Vernon.
Thank you, Aleks. My name is Aleks Vernon. I am currently at Detroit Mercy School of Law, but I live in Windsor, and all of that is the traditional and contemporary territory of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Wendat nations, the Three Fires Confederacy. At Detroit Mercy, we have a dual degree program with the University of Windsor. So at any given point in time, I have a lot of Canadian students working with me on cases. What kind of cases? Well, I like to describe myself as the unofficial honorary ambassador of well-meaning Canadians like yourself to people that have been rejected at the Canadian border. I had the audacity to present myself as such to the consul here in Detroit, but a lot of our work involves representing people who've been rejected at the Canadian border by the Safe Third Country Agreement and who've ended up detained in the United States or worse. Some of them have been deported. And I'll tell you more later on, but I'll let my other colleagues introduce themselves.
Orlando?
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Aleks. Hi, everyone. Orlando Tovar, he, him pronouns. I'd like to first acknowledge that I'm joining today from the lands of the Mi'kmaq people, specifically Jipuktuk, also known today under the colonial name of Halifax, Nova Scotia. I am one of the co-executive directors of the Rainbow Refugee Association of Nova Scotia. And at the very core of our mandate, it's to facilitate private sponsorship of LGBTQI individuals who have fled their countries of origin due to their persecution because of their diverse OGSC. So we believe at RANS that every individual has the right to live free from persecution and discrimination, regardless of their status, regardless of their sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or sex characteristics, and that's everywhere, and that also includes Canada. So I'm very excited to be here and share meaningful conversations with everyone, and to talk a little bit of like the barriers that we also see in each of our like fields of work. So once again, thank you, Debbie. Thank you to the OCASI team for having me here.
Go ahead, Eusebio.
Okay, my name is Eusebio Garcia. I'm the refugee and settlement worker at the Quaker Committee for Refugees in Toronto. And also I'm a track representative at the Immigration Holding Center. Track goes for the Toronto Refugee Affairs Council. I've been working as a refugee and settlement worker for the last, I guess, 35 years with the Quakers. And the last 27 years, I've been going to, I would say, the largest immigration center in Canada, which is here in Toronto. I know for those who are connected, you might not know, but there's 3 immigration holding centers in Canada. The biggest, as I just said, is in Toronto. The second one, I would say, is the one in Laval, Quebec. Toronto has the capacity for 195 beds, Laval 150, and I know there's now one in BC, in Surrey, I think it is, and they have a capacity for beds, 70 beds. So as I mentioned before, I've been doing this work for some time, and I'm really grateful that OCASI invited me to be part of this panel.
Thank you so much to everybody. So we're just going to jump right into it. So the US is closing its borders harder than ever. Should Canada end the safe third country agreement instead of relying on US policies that put refugees in danger? But is the US really safe for all refugees, especially LGBTQ, Black and Indigenous migrants? Orlando, given your work with Rainbow Refugee Association of Nova Scotia, can you kick us off with this discussion?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Yvonne. Well, I think in a short answer, I think the SDCA should be rescinded, because it is just not like failing refugees. It is actively putting them in a very dangerous position. So the premise of the SDCA is like both Canada and the US offer equal protection for refugees, but in reality, and especially nowadays, we know that it might not be the case, like especially for LGBTQI people, Black and Indigenous migrants, and other racialized communities. In the US, refugee protection has been deeply inconsistent and in many cases hostile. So for many years, we've seen how Black, Indigenous, and other racialized migrants experience disproportionate policing, detention, xenophobia, and racism. We've seen many examples of that in the recent years with the treatment of like the Haitian community or other Latin American asylum seekers. And the important part here, it's like in many cases, people are just in transit through the US. So in my past work experience, while I was working directly with refugee claimants, many of them from Latin American countries, it was clear that they had fled their countries of origin looking to get to Canada and seek protection here because they had experienced that level of unsafety and discrimination in the US. However, due to the SDCA, they were technically forced to claim for refugee protection there instead of here. And when it comes to LGBTQI refugees or asylum seekers, the situation is even like worse. Nowadays, like we know that immigration detention centers have an extensive record of detaining queer and trans asylum seekers in inhumane conditions, often subjecting them to physical and sexual violence, solitary confinement, denial of healthcare, more recently, even erasing their very own existence. And I'm not talking about a government doing it only against like foreign nationals, but their own citizens. So what is that if not state-funded persecution? And how Canada can ensure that refugees have access to their international rights to claim for refugee protection while we are like outsourcing our refugee obligations to a country which is actively attacking those rights. If you ask me, I don't think that's compatible with the principle of like non-refoulement established in the convention, because and it's not only the U.S. government who is acting against it, but if Canada is taking the SDCA as a justification to deny the access to refugee protection for people coming here, isn't it Canada also going against the principle of non-refoulement? So I think it's time to reassess what we as a country consider as a safe country, and reassess the validity that this agreement should have.
Those are some really good points, and outsourcing, unfortunately, is a good word to use for this situation. Who else? Please jump in.
Yeah, I want to jump in just to first, I completely support what Orlando is saying. The U.S. cannot be considered a safe country. Blankly saying that a country is safe and then understanding that their practices are actually putting at risk LGBTQI people's lives or trans and gender diverse rights. And not only them, but also racialized people and people who are escaping persecution for different reasons. It's unreasonable. I know that here in Canada, we have had a lot of conversations about striking down the SDCA, and there's some legal challenges that are in place to be able to do that. And people talk about the safety valves and how we can, implement them. But the truth is, when we're turning away a trans or gender diverse person from the Canadian border and we're sending them back to the US, first, that person most likely will be in immigration detention. And then the second thing that is happening is that there's 97% chance that that person will suffer sexual violence within that detention as well. And then there is the fact that they will get deported to their death. So we need to be very actively thinking about how we as Canadians and Canadian society and Canadian government is being complicit to eroding the rights of people who are seeking protection. And people who are seeking protection who cross borders, they're not illegal. They're not doing anything illegal, but actually they are just exercising an internationally recognized and protected right that they have to seek protection. And so therefore we need to think about how we have now through the years made it more difficult for people to reach Canada, and what does it mean for those folks? And not only for the people who are currently in the US, but for people who travel through Mexico and then want to cross to the US, and what happens in that border also deeply affects us. I'll leave it there to leave my colleagues more time as well.
Aleks, Vernon, you had raised your hand. Go ahead.
You know, I agree with everything the previous colleagues have said. I wanted to give a concrete example of a case that's exemplary of the current situation. Our clinic has been representing a person who's been detained upon arrival, as are many of the other people that we've encountered, for over a year now, a year and a half, for nothing other than seeking asylum at the southern border. This person at first presented as a gay man from a country that has a pattern and practice of persecution of gay men. Over the course of that detention, had the opportunity to work with a psychologist, and came to the understanding that in fact she's a trans person, she's a trans woman. And we could see, we had a discussion about pronouns, we had a discussion about transfer to a transgender detention facility. We obviously tried to get her released, but that wasn't happening. And then right before our eyes, there was a change of administration and everything changed, and the government no longer recognized trans people. The immigration judge we had did, but nonetheless, the person remained detained and suffered attacks and insults from other detainees that were anti-gay, anti-trans. And here's the part that's probably the most disturbing. We obtained a grant of protection for this person. The judge agreed that this person would more likely than not be tortured or persecuted in her home country. But because she failed to use this CBP-1 app, she's now subject to one of these bars to asylum that most immigrants coming at the southern border are going to be subject to, and is only able to be granted withholding of removal. That is protection against deportation to her home country. But get this, has not yet been released, and is still vulnerable to deportation to a third country that she has never been to, because the United States is now recognizing agreements with places like Panama and El Salvador. And you've seen the people deported to these ultramax prisons in El Salvador. This is the reality that migrants are facing and refugees are facing in America.
Thank you. Aleks, do you want to add anything else to that? Okay. So we're going to move on, and this question is kind of can build off of it, because Canada, the US, work together to keep refugees out. How can we break this system while building stronger cross-border solidarity? I think something we're identifying is we are intrinsically attached, right? And these policies do have to speak to both the countries. And despite all the negative rhetoric and our concerns and the negativity between our two countries, we still have to work together. And as I mentioned earlier, it's an opportunity for stronger cross-border solidarity. So Aleks, given your work with Rainbow Refugee Society, can you tell us what this might look like?
Yes, I mean, first I want to say that for a long time, queer communities have understood that who keeps us safe is we keep us safe. So it is our community who actually keeps us safe, and we can't rely on the government with changing policies or changing political spectrums to keep us safe. So we rely on community, we rely on society, and Canada has a long-standing tradition of actually welcoming refugees, and not only welcoming refugees, but also in creating systems around that welcoming. However, we've seen lately how that narrative has changed, and how refugees and migrants have been scapegoated for the economic crises, for the housing crises. And then we have a previous Minister of Immigration also making those links, talking about the housing crisis and justifying or making that a justification for why we're changing some of our policies and not allowing people to cross the border. And at the same time, how is people supposed to come to Canada if they can't access, temporary resident permits, and we are effectively closing the southern border? There is no way for people to reach Canada at this point to claim asylum. So we are eroding the rights to claim asylum in that way. So what we've done and what we continue to do is create solidarity amongst different organizations, have connections with organizations in the US, have connections with organizations in Mexico as well. Like concretely right now, we are in contact with a trans woman who's in Mexico, and I was able to connect them to a local organization there who's able to provide her with support so that then we can do a resettlement pathway. So really what it is how do we change the narrative? And how do we change the narrative here in Canada? One of the things that I've been thinking about changing the narrative has to do with creating relationships. So are we creating relationships? Are we in relationship with migrants, with refugee people, with trans people? Do we understand the humanity and the shared humanity that we have with each other? And can we then translate that into what we ask our representatives to do? And in that solidarity, in that pushing for our political representatives, but at the same time creating relationships with other organizations who are working across the border, not only in the US, but in Mexico and in other parts of the world, how do we make sure that we are pushing for those policies to change and at the same time strategizing, advocating together, and finding ways to really provide that protection and to make sure that those protections are being upheld. There's no unicorn answer that we can find, but I would say what have worked from our end has been in creating relationships, in understanding the different circumstances that people are going through, and in sharing resources so that we can protect them and also support them as best as we can.
Eusebio, do you have anything to add to that? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
I was just thinking that when it comes to that, there's a case right now at the border of a Salvadorian family who tried to enter Canada. They have, the Safe Three Country Agreement, it has its exceptions. So they have family here in Canada, but I guess that the documents that were presented at the border here, which are genuine, were not valid to CBSA officers. So they were returned to the U.S. They're held right now in a detention center in Buffalo. And we're just thinking, like, when it comes to creating alliances, there is this border virtual legal clinic now that basically they're been helping this family. We don't know what the outcome is going to be, but just going back to reinforcing alliances, I think there's a greater need now to create alliances here at home with the US, but also, as Aleks mentioned, also with the Global South, especially now in the context of what's going on around the world. I cannot stop thinking about what's going on in El Salvador with this mega jail, and the government of that country participating with the government of the US in putting people in jails. And to me, I mean, that's inhuman and is something that goes international laws. And I wonder if, as a coalition, I know we have the Canadian Council for Refugees, and in the US they have bodies like the Canadian Council for Refugees that represent immigrants and refugees. But I think there is this great need to create alliances, as I said before, with people from the South, like Central American countries, and see how we can coordinate and help each other.
Anything else from our other panelists?
I would just echo what Aleks and Eusebio said before. Like I truly believe like knowledge sharing and unifying advocacy is key. Like I have the fortune to work with Aleks specifically through the National Coalition from Borders to Belonging, which gets together many refugee-serving organizations, specifically working with LGBTQI refugees and US LGBTQIA newcomers. And I think like unifying our voices is a way to be heard. Like I like to say, 1,000 voices just speaking in every direction might not necessarily be understood, but if we speak at the same tone and the same level, we will be heard.
Thank you for that. I think we're going to move on and kind of talk about something that I think a lot of Canadians don't really understand, which is detention and detention centers. So many people in Canada would like to know what things are like for people in the immigration detention centers and how they can be supported. Eusebio, given your years of experience working alongside detained migrants, including refugee claimants, could you please help answer that question and give us some insight on what it's like and what could be done?
Well, I'll tell you a little bit about what I cannot only speak about the holding center here in Toronto. It's different, I know, in Montreal and also in BC. But when it comes to the holding center in Toronto, when it comes to the facilities, I could tell you that there is, compared to other places in North America, it's a place where it has a gym, it has a multi-faith prayer room, it also has a library, and when it comes to the food, and this is something that we've been fighting for years, the quality of food nowadays, they have improved that part too. And when it comes to programs, we have Romero House coming in on Saturdays, and they do a yoga class, and there's also addiction counseling, and recently they started with this dog therapy pet program, and that's when it comes to what's going on inside the holding center. When it comes to the work that we do as representative from TRAC, we offer being in immigration detention, I should say, is quite challenging. Detainees are often experiencing stress. They deal with mental health issues. Most of the people now at the holding center deal with mental health issues. And they always, this question that you get from them, everybody wonders about what's going to happen in the future with their cases. They have, when it comes, they come to see you, they have difficulty sometimes trying to access legal aid or reaching family members or friends, or even obtaining help with filling some forms for immigration. And many times when it comes to me, because I speak the language, they come looking for assistance with interpretation when they want to communicate with lawyers or any legal representative. So what to do to support them? We're there on the ground. I believe the same thing happens when it comes to Montreal. There's people from agencies coming in to help them. I would say that what we need to do and continue to do is to advocate for better policies by urging the local MPs to push to improve systems and alternatives, particularly for undocumented refugees and also for children. In Toronto, it's been a long time since I saw a child in the holding center, but it's not, it's not in policy. They could change that anytime they want. And I know when it comes to Laval, in the past, when people were crossing at Roxham Road, there were kids in the holding center in Montreal. So why should they be there? And it has to do with how the politicians see refugees. And that has to be stopped, I think. And the only way that we can do that is just, loving our local politicians. Also, another way I would say to help with the cause will be to basically help those agencies who go into these holding centers. For example, here in Toronto, we have FCA Refugee Center. We have the Quaker Committee for Refugees, and also we have people from the Refugee Law Office. And nationally, we count with the assistance of CCR when it comes to lobbying the national government. What else can I say? Oh, when it comes to the holding center, also in Toronto, I have to mention that we cover 5 days a week. 3 days are covered by the Refugee Law Office, and 1 day is covered by FCA Refugee Center, and Thursdays. Today I'm supposed to be in jail, but I'm here because I couldn't do I couldn't connect from the holding center. So that's basically what I would say about the conditions at the holding center.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that's very insightful. And again, many Canadians don't have an idea what that's like. We'll zoom out and then we'll engage in a conversation. Zooming out, there's also detention taking place in the US and mass deportation from the US to other parts of the world, as Aleks had mentioned earlier. And of course, Aleks, given your expertise on this topic, can you shed some light on what's happening and its impacts? And particularly if these mass deportations globally can somehow still impact Canada?
Yes, one very important situation I wanted to draw to people's attention is the fact that many people in Canada are going to have family members or loved ones that are trying to make it to Canada, and of course you have to pass through the United States. They will most likely end up in detention, and if people end up in detention in the United States, you can expect that they are an immediate pathway to deportation. And so the important thing is that and the temptation might be for the person to say, oh, actually, I have a family member in Canada. I just want to get to Canada. They may have a safe third country exception. That's not going to be of any interest to a US deportation officer, and they may find themselves deported to Mexico or one of these other countries or to their home country unless they shout their fear. And it's important that they shout their fear because the US is no longer, and this is from the Biden administration, affirmatively screening people for fear. So you must manifest your fear. And how do you know who to manifest it to? So I'm telling people that make sure they tell everybody, the private detention facility staff, the ICE officer, the health staff, that they have a fear of going back and that they need to speak to an asylum officer. Only then will they trigger the process of a credible fear or reasonable fear screening with an asylum officer that can set them up on a pathway to a claim for protection in the United States. And effectively, they need to be prepared to litigate their entire refugee claim from detention. And the families in Canada need to be prepared to send them evidence, to hire them a lawyer, because it might not be, it certainly will not be enough to tell ICE, the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that, oh, I have a legal way to get to Canada and I want to get to Canada. It's not gonna be enough. So yeah, in the US, there are at any given day about 40,000 people, immigrants detained. And that's compared to, with, for example, 3,000, I think, in Canada is the number. So they're detaining it at 10 times the rate. And of course, they're running up against capacity issues. They haven't yet been able to ramp up the number of detention space. They will. They have tent camps that they can bring online. They've got all sorts of ways to ramp up capacity. But the way they've been getting around that is, of course, just sending people back right away. Sending them, just dropping them off in Mexico, or sending them to El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama, or some of them are ending up in Guantanamo. Effectively, what we're seeing is a complete collapse of the refugee protection system in the United States. And more than that, as you've probably heard in the news and from other commentators, we're seeing really a breakdown of the rule of law in the United States. And I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that. So it does not bode well for refugees and migrants in the United States.
But may I interject to ask, it seems like we're seeing a breakdown of the rule of law everywhere, though, right?
Exactly.
Because these countries, these third countries who are accepting the deportation planes, right? They're not American. There's this international law. And is what we're going through a situation of just commit the crime or do the thing that's illegal and then have them try through lawyers, if they have the means, to rescue them? There's no kind of proactive aspect to any of this, right?
Well, I mean, are you saying, like, how do people access asylum in the United States, sort of thing? Like, is there a way for
or
them
if they
to
get
safely...
if they get deported, right? It's kind of just like they're what we're seeing is these people are not having their rights respected, and there seems to be nothing they can do except go through with the process. Then when they end up in El Salvador or when they end up in Panama, then they can try to get a lawyer to reverse things, or that's not even possible.
We're obviously, I mean, there are some efforts to try and do that, but like with the person that was deported, the Venezuelan that was deported to El Salvador, the U.S. government has acknowledged that we may have made a mistake, but we're not able to compel the Salvadorian government to return the person to our custody, and so it's an uphill battle. Be sure that it's going to be challenged, and there's going to be court orders. but also, I mean, we have an administration that has expressly said, well, we don't think we need to obey court orders that we don't think are lawful. So this is different. This is different from the last time. I don't want to be alarmist. And I want to echo some sentiments that I think somebody else had said before, that what a time to be alive, what a blessing to be alive at this time when we have an opportunity to shine a light when there's so much darkness encroaching. So I want to be upbeat on that count.
Other panelists want to chime in?
Well, I wanted to go back also to the detention centers here in Canada and talk a little bit about BC, and we have a very new, not so new, but fairly new detention center, holding center in Surrey, BC. And they outsource their security. So at the same time that we as LGBTQI have been talking about, training officers and training CBSA officers on how to treat or relate to trans and gender diverse people or LGBTQI, then you have a security detail that has been outsourced to a private company where we have no idea what kind of training they have received. And then we see mistreatment in the detention center. For instance, there was a case about a person who English wasn't their first language, so they wrote something in French of the sort of "Je suis homosexuel," but they misspelled it. So the people interpreted as them being homophobic. So then they took him and put him in a provincial prison for that purpose, until I connected with the chaplain who was volunteering and going in, and is also a queer person and happens to be my partner. So I said to my partner, hey, can we, when she told me, hey, this is what this person said, I said, I think this person is trying to say that they are part of the LGBTQ community. And we found out that was the case. And then we provided them with support to get them out of provincial jail. But there's also been cases of trans women when the detention centers don't feel that they have the capacity to provide them with gender affirming care, for instance, and they don't have access to hormones or medications that are that they need. They were also transferred to the provincial jails, and that was happening until we made this whole campaign to try to stop that. But to say is that even though there's a huge difference between the US and Canada, and there's 3,000 people maybe compared to 40,000, and maybe the conditions are not as horrifying, still people are denied their rights, still people are being misgendered, still people are facing discrimination, and still the security of those centers are being given to private companies, which we have no idea what kind of training they're receiving, and people are being discriminated upon. So I wanted to also emphasize that about detention here.
I would like just to say something when it comes to detention in Canada. I think now, given the conditions in the whole country, I think it's imperative that we as members of civil society and workers who go into these holding centers, that we start creating a national alliance, I guess. I don't know what would be the right word to say, but I'm just thinking about what happens at any individual detention center in Canada. I know there's differences, and one of the differences that we have, I guess, when it comes to access to legal assistance. I know in Ontario, we're fortunate to have a refugee law office helping detainees right from the beginning. Right now, people don't have to wait to see if they're going to get a lawyer when they go for the first detention review, which happens in 48 hours. And then, but I don't know what the case is, for example, in BC. But apart from that, we have what we call here the quality of life meeting, which is basically a meeting that takes place every 4 months. And people who go to these meetings are people from CBSA, people from, we have sometimes a representative from the UN, from Red Cross, some local shelters here, and of course, the people who go into the holding center. And we use this space to bring complaints or concerns to CBSA. Perhaps that will be something that, we should, you could look into it in BC and also in Laval, in Montreal. and we can end up, sharing best practices, for example, because I know when it comes to CBSA, when they have their regional meetings, they invite people from other provinces, and based on what they discuss, they bring that back to their places. And we could do the same thing as civil society, I think.
Just to answer to Eusebio, we do have a quality of life committee also here in Surrey. I don't know how active they're being right now. But the truth is that do we actually need detention? And can we find alternatives to detention? That's the core issue. I mean, we can put all these patches and of course support the people who are in detention, and we want to make sure that their rights are not being violated, and that they can at one point go through the refugee process and then be in society. But the question is, why are we incarcerating people who are not a risk to Canadian society in any way? Why are we making those choices? And why aren't we implementing alternatives to detention? Even though, yes, the Quality of Life Committee is a good committee, and I think it's good for us to know what's going on and to support people, but at the same time to talk about, do we actually, as Canadians, need to be incarcerated people who are being persecuted? Refugees are not a threat. They are fleeing threat to their lives. And so just considering that in our practices.
I'm just going to move us to Q&A because I know we can talk about this for a very long time among all of us. So I think, Aleks, you can answer this question about, do you have any numbers as to how many people will be deported to Canada from the US? Will they get the refugee status here in Canada?
Deported from Canada to the US?
It's deported from US to Canada.
From US to Canada. Well, I mean, the only people that would be deported to Canada would be people that are Canadian citizens or have some sort of claim to being in Canada. I don't think that's what the question is. But interestingly enough, we are trying to, as a strategy, identify to ICE people who may have a safe third country exception, so that, if they're not going to grant them relief in the United States, we're requesting that ICE consider releasing them or taking them to the border to be effectively deported to Canada as a third country alternative, because they have this legal pathway to go to Canada. So I'm not sure if that's what the question is, but that's my answer. That's how I interpret it. It is a strategy that we're using. Yeah.
And I don't know who can take this one, but are shelters, are they ready to take refugees? And do we have enough shelter beds for these refugees?
Well,
I think this might be a Toronto problem, right? Or maybe Orlando, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, first of all, the reality of the shelter housing can vary a lot and across the country, but I think it's also important to emphasize, like, refugees and asylum seekers. Like, I guess we need to challenge that narrative, like refugees and asylum seekers are a burden, and that, like, they are automatically gonna be, like, in need of being in a shelter. Like, yes, in some cases can happen, but, like, refugees are not a burden. Like, in many cases, like, the people we work with, we see, like, they are very capable individuals who were, like, able to survive, like, very threatening conditions and circumstances. So they are not here just, like, looking to be taken care by somebody else, whether it's a government, whether it's another person or organization. It's like we see how they are the experts of their own experience, and in many cases they just need tools for them to be able to thrive by themselves. Like, if we come to numbers, specifically talking to shelters, specifically talking to where we operate, let's say at Rams, well, yes, definitely we do have a shelter crisis, or, like, not enough places, but I think the narrative should be changed.
Eusebio, there's a question for you, I think, that can answer, which is, you mentioned that children are still in the detention centers. Do you know how they are treated?
I could tell you, I did mention that when it comes to Toronto, it's been years now that there haven't been any kids. I know when it comes to Laval, when people were crossing in Roxanne, there were kids in the holding center, and I don't know what the conditions in that holding center is. But I just remember when it comes to Toronto, there is at the holding center here, they separate people into what they call wings. There's most males are I think they have about 5 or 6 wings, but the most males are in 4 wings, and there is a wing for women, and there is a wing for families. Families meaning women and kids. And I remember in those days they had a playground for the kids. And of course there was special food for kids, diapers and all that kind of stuff. At the end of the day, I think part of why they're not bringing kids in the holding center there is because there was this big uproar when it came to the news, telling the public that, you know, what immigration was doing. I want to believe that this is one of the reasons why they stop having kids at the holding center. And every time that there's a kid at the holding center, they call us up and they tell us because they don't want any scandals. And at the end of the day, even if it's, you know, the conditions to compare to other holding centers are quite good, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if the cage is made out of gold, still a cage, right? So, but I would say that when it came to the treatment of kids in Toronto, at least, they were okay, but just being at the holding center is not okay.
Yeah. Well, our time is flying by, so we have one last question. I think we're going to go to closing statements, which is where can we advocate to get Canada to withdraw from the Safe Third Country Agreement?
Well, I would say that there's many ways that you can do that. And first is vote for representatives that actually are in favor of striking down the Safe Third Country Agreement. Connect with your MPs, connect with your MLAs or MAs, depending on the province that you're in. But I think pushing for political change is one of them. And also tell the government of Canada, the federal government of Canada, that you do not stand with the Safe Third Country Agreement and that it should be struck down. I think that especially now that we are heading towards an election, we can make it an election also issue and bring it to the forefront. Yeah, that's what I'm going to say for now.
Okay. And I think so. We have one last question that is kind of acting as your closing statement. So please answer it and then kind of say other things that you might want to, which is that. So the question is, refugee-led groups know the solutions best, but are often ignored. Similarly, Indigenous land rights are often overlooked in immigration policies. How can we make sure the right people are being heard and leading the fight for their rights? And again, please let us know your closing wrap-up statements as well. Maybe we can go in reverse order. Eusebio?
I think it has to do with ideally with the shifting of power. And by that, I mean amplifying our voices and ensuring meaningful participation. One of the ways I'll think that will have to do with increasing of funding to support refugee and indigenous-led organizations. Also creating policy spaces where communities have a direct seat at the table, and not just as advisors, but also as decision makers. And also when it comes to the media, the academics and allies, I think they could help by amplifying their voices rather than speaking on their behalf. And last but not less important for me is when it comes to politicians and policymakers, they must be held accountable to those communities by implementing, I guess, mechanisms that ensure their input translate into action and not just discussions, because we usually go into all these meetings and stuff, and they're promises, fake promises from politicians, and most of the time nothing happens.
Orlando?
Well, I'll repeat it. I think like refugees, newcomers, queer people, trans people, we are all like experts of our own experience, and we know what's like best. Each community know what's best for them and what they need for their safety and dignity. However, in many cases, a lot of decisions that will directly impact these communities are made without us at the table. So kind of going through the same direction as Eusebio said, like I think we need to start like ending tokenism and like supporting real leadership. So we need to have refugees, indigenous people, newcomers, queers and trans individuals, not just being consulted, but leading. So, and that makes like making space at every level in every entity. So whether it's government, whether it's a private enterprise, like whether it's a board, whether it's a senior management or leadership position, it's like we need to shift the power to the people who's going to be impacted by those decisions and talks. And I mean that also means like investing in those organizations. But also I would like to like kind of just point that yes, we do have these like refugee serving organizations that we are doing the job and advocating. But I also think like advocating it's not just about that environment or like lobbying governments. It's also how we individually show up for refugees in our daily lives. It's about standing against xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia. How do we challenge these narratives and dismantle systemic barriers, and recognize that refugees deserve the same rights, respect, and safety and freedom as everyone else? Because that's what the Singh Decision did. When the court ruled that refugee claimants had the right to an oral hearing under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, what they actually meant or recognized is that everyone on Canadian soil had the right to be protected by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. So we need to like, yes, there has been advances in our system, but like we need to keep fighting those systemic barriers that can start sometimes with us. Learn how do we show up for people, and sometimes it looks as something as simple as standing in solidarity with somebody who had fled persecution.
Aleks, Vernon?
I think what I'm going to say will echo much of what's been said before, but as a closing ask, I'm going to suggest that people ask their candidates, do they support Canada continuing to reject people seeking protection at the Canadian border, but then to include some examples. I tried to raise this in a town hall with Minister Chrystia Freeland. Will Canada continue to reject Ukrainians who come to the border from the United States seeking protection? Will Canada reject LGBTQ persons? So pick some high-profile examples that you think might attract the attention of your candidate, of your MP, and put it in those terms. And also to echo statements made by others, I think we need to amplify the voices of the refugees, amplify the voices of Indigenous people. I think it's quite interesting that some of the places where desperate refugees are attempting to cross into Canada are occurring on Indigenous territories. And I've heard from people on those territories their concerns that they don't want their first responders having to fish bodies out of the St. Lawrence River. They don't want to see people running and hiding in the snow. Those concerns need to be amplified. I saw recently that the Mohawk governments were challenging the Canadian government and the US government to include them in conversations about what's happening on their sovereign Indigenous territory. So I think that's part of the solution, is amplifying those voices.
All right, last words go to Aleks.
Thank you. I think the people most impacted, and this is just repetition also from what my colleagues have said, like refugees, migrant justice organizers, Indigenous land defenders already have the solutions, or at least are working actively on the solutions. The problem is that they are often sidelined in policy-making spaces. So to shift this, we need to stop consulting. There's so many consultations happening all the time, and we need to start resourcing. And that means funding refugee-led and Indigenous-led initiatives, building decision-making power in those communities, and stepping back when we're not the ones directly affected. Solidarity isn't about speaking for others, but it is about making space, redistributing resources and power, and ensuring that those whose lives, ensuring those who've lived the struggle are really leading the fight. And so how do we make sure that those are leading the fight and that we're listening to our indigenous elders who actually have a relationship to the land and a relationship to justice and restorative and transformative justice that would really benefit us all, especially in these times.
Thank you, everyone. That was beautiful, beautifully said, and I think we will start using the term resourcing. Stop consulting, start resourcing.
Start resourcing. Yes,
I love
exactly.
that. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us. In the chat, there is another event happening right now with the Canadian Council for Refugees, if you want to join that. But thank you to our panelists. If you could, give a clap either virtually or open your mic, and we'll all join together again and fight the good fight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.
See you guys.
Thank you all.